The Autumn After Next by Margaret St. Clair. Narrated by William Skye. Being a wizard missionary to the Frel needed more than magic. It called for a miracle. The spell the Frel were casting ought to have drawn the moon down from the heavens, made water run uphill, and inverted the order of the seasons. But since they had got Braw's blood instead of Newt's, were using algernon instead of vervet juice, and were 3 days later than the solstice anyhow, nothing happened. Nishan watched their antics with a bitter smile. He tried hard with them. The Frel were really a challenge to evangelical wizardry. They had some natural talent for magic, as was evinced by the frequent attempts they made to perform it, and they were interested in what he told them about its capacities. But they simply wouldn't take the trouble to do it right. How long had they been stamping around in their circle anyhow? Since early moonset, and it was now almost dawn. No doubt they would go on stamping all next day if not interrupted. It was time to call a halt. Nishan strode into the middle of the circle. Run, the village chief, looked up from his drumming. "Go away," he said. "You'll spoil the charm." "What charm? Can't you see by now, Rahun, that it isn't going to work?" "Of course it will. It just takes time." "Hell it will. Hell it does. Watch." Nishan pushed Rahun to one side and squatted down in the center of the circle. From the pockets of his black robe he produced stylus, dragon's blood, oil of anointing, and salt. He drew a design on the ground with the stylus, dropped dragon's blood at the corners of the parallelogram, and touched the inner cusps with the oil. Then, sighting carefully at the double red and white sun, which was just coming up, he touched the outer cusps with salt. An intense smoke sprang up. When the smoke died away, a small lizard-like creature was visible in the parallelogram. "Tell the demon what you want," Nishan ordered the Frel. The Frel hesitated. They had few wants, after all, which was one of the things that made teaching them magic difficult. "2 big dialer melons," one of the younger ones said at last. "A new undana necklace," said another. "A tutor like the one you have," said Rahun, who was ambitious. "Straw for a new roof on my hut," said one of the older females. "That's enough for now," Nishan interrupted. "The demon can't bring you a tutor, Rahun. You have to ask another sort of demon for that. The other things he can get. Samel, to work." The lizard in the parallelogram twitched its tail. It disappeared and returned almost immediately with melons, a handsome necklace, and an enormous heap of straw. "Can I go now?" it asked. "Yes." Nishan turned to the Frel who were sharing the dialer melons out around their circle. "You see, that's how it ought to be. You cast a spell, you're careful with it, and it works, right away." "When you do it, it works," Rin answered. "Magic works when anybody does it, but you have to do it right." Rahun raised his mud-plastered shoulders in a shrug. "It's such a lot of drees doing it that way. Magic ought to be fun." He walked away, munching on a slice of the melon the demon had brought. Nishan stared after him, his eyes hot. Drees was a Frel word that referred originally to the nasal drip that accompanied that race's virulent head colds. It had been extended to mean almost anything annoying. The Frel, who spent much of their time sitting in the rain, had a lot of colds in the head. Wasn't there anything to be done with these people? Even the simplest spell was too dreesish for them to bother with. He was getting a headache. He'd better perform a headache-removing spell. He retired to the hut the Frel had assigned to him. The spell worked, of course, but it left him feeling soggy and dispirited. He was still standing in the hut, wondering what he should do next, when his big black and gold tutor in the corner gave a faint woof. That meant headquarters wanted to communicate with him. Nishan carefully aligned the tutor, which is basically a sort of lens for focusing neural force, with the rising double suns. He moved his couch out into a parallel position and lay down on it. In a minute or two, he was deep in a cataleptic trance. The message from headquarters was long, circuitous, and couched in the elaborate, ego-caressing ceremonial of high magic, but its gist was clear enough. Your report received, it boiled down to. We are glad to hear that you are keeping on with the Frel. We do not expect you to succeed with them, none of the other magical missionaries we have sent out ever has. But if you should succeed, by any chance, you would get your senior warlock's rating immediately. It would be no exaggeration, in fact, to say that the highest office in the Brotherhood would be open to you. Nishan came out of his trance. His eyes were round with wonder and cupidity. His senior warlock's rating? Why, he wasn't due to get that for nearly 4 more 605-day years. And the highest office in the Brotherhood? That could mean anything. Anything. He hadn't realized the Brotherhood set such store on converting the Frel. Well, now, a reward like that was worth going to some trouble for. Nishan sat down on his couch, his elbows on his knees, his fists pressed against his forehead, and tried to think. The Frel liked magic, but they were lazy. Anything that involved accuracy impressed them as dreesish. And they didn't want anything. That was the biggest difficulty. Magic had nothing to offer them. He had never, Nishan thought, heard one of the Frel express a want. Wait, though, there was Rhun. He had shown a definite interest in Nishan's tutor. Something in its intricate, florid black and gold curves seemed to fascinate him. True, he hadn't been interested in it for its legitimate uses, which were to extend and develop a magician's spiritual power. He probably thought that having it would give him more prestige and influence among his people. But for one of the Frel to say, "I wish I had that about anything whatever," meant that he could be worked on. Could the tutor be used as a bribe? Nishan sighed heavily. Getting a tutor was painful and laborious. A tutor was carefully fitted to an individual magician's personality. In a sense, it was a part of his personality, and if Nishan let Rhun have his tutor, he would be letting him have a part of himself. But the stakes were enormous. Nishan got up from his couch. It had begun to rain, but he didn't want to spend time performing a rain-repelling spell. He wanted to find Rhun. Rhun was standing at the edge of the swamp, luxuriating in the downpour. The mud had washed from his shoulders, and he was already sniffling. Nishan came to the point directly. "I'll give you my tutor," he said, almost choking over the words, "if you'll do a spell, a simple spell, mind you, exactly right." Rhun hesitated. Nishan felt an impulse to kick him. Then he said, "Well..." Nishan began his instructions. It wouldn't do for him to help Rhun too directly, but he was willing to do everything reasonable. Rhun listened, scratching himself in the armpits and sneezing from time to time. After Nishan had been through the directions twice, Rhun stopped him. "No, don't bother telling me again, it's just more drees. Give me the materials and I'll show you. Don't forget you're giving me the tutor for this." He started off, Nishan after him, to the latter's hut. While Nishan looked on tensely, Rhun began going through the actions Nishan had told him. Halfway through the first decade, he forgot. He inverted the order of the hand passes, sprinkled salt on the wrong point, and mispronounced the names in the invocation. When he pulled his hands apart at the end, only a tiny yellow flame sprang up. Nishan cursed bitterly. Rhun, however, was delighted. "Look at that, will you?" he exclaimed, clapping his chapped, scabby little hands together. "It worked! I'll take the tutor home with me now." "The tutor? For that? You didn't do the spell right." Rhun stared at him indignantly. "You mean you're not going to give me the tutor after all the trouble I went to? I only did it as a favour, really. Nishan, I think it's very mean of you." "Try the spell again." "Oh, drees, you're too impatient. You never give anything time to work." He got up and walked off. For the next few days, everybody in the village avoided Nishan. They all felt sorry for Rahun, who'd worked so hard, done everything he was told to, and been cheated out of his tutor by Nishan. In the end, the magician, cursing his own weakness, surrendered the tutor to Rahun. The accusatory atmosphere in the normally indifferent Frel was intolerable. But now what was he to do? He'd given up his tutor, he had to ask Rahun to lend it to him when he wanted to contact headquarters, and the senior rating was no nearer than before. His head ached constantly, and all the spells he performed to cure the pain left him feeling wretchedly tired out. Magic, however, is an art of many resources, not all of them savoury. Nishan, in his desperation, began to invoke demons more disreputable than those he would ordinarily have consulted. In effect, he turned for help to the magical underworld. His thuggish informants were none too consistent. One demon told him one thing, another something else. The consensus, though, was that while there was nothing the Frel actually wanted enough to go to any trouble for it, they didn't even want to get rid of their nasal drip, for example. In a perverse way, they were proud of it. There was one thing they disliked intensely: Nishan himself. The Frel thought, the demons reported, that he was inconsiderate, tactless, officious, and a crashing bore. They regarded him as the psychological equivalent of the worst case of Drees ever known, carried to the nth power. They wished he'd drop dead or hang himself. Nishan dismissed the last of the demons. His eyes had begun to shine. The Frel thought he was a nuisance, did they? They thought he was the most annoying thing they'd encountered in the course of their racial history? Good. Fine. Splendid. Then he'd really annoy them. He'd have to watch out for poison, of course, but in the end they'd turn to magic to get rid of him. They'd have to. And then he'd have them. They'd be caught. One act of communal magic that really worked, and they'd be sold on magic. He'd be sure of his senior rating. Nishan began his campaign immediately. Where the Frel were, there was he. He was always on hand with unwanted explanations, hypercritical objections, and maddening wouldn't-it-be-betters. Whereas earlier in his evangelical mission he had confined himself to pointing out how much easier magic would make life for the Frel, he now counselled and advised them on every phase of their daily routine, from mud-smearing to rain-sitting, and from the time they got up until they went to bed. He even pursued them with advice after they got into bed, and told them how to run their sex lives, advice which the Frel, who set quite as much store by their sex lives as anybody does, resented passionately. But most of all, he harped on their folly in putting up with nasal drip, and instructed them over and over again in the details of a charm, a quite simple charm, for getting rid of it. The charm would, he informed them, work equally well against anything, or person, that they found annoying. The food the Frel brought him began to have a highly peculiar taste. Nishan grinned and hung a theriacal charm, a first-class antidote to poison, around his neck. The Frel's distaste for him bothered him naturally, but he could stand it. When he had repeated the anti-annoyance charm to a group of Frel last night, he had noticed that Rahun was listening eagerly. It wouldn't be much longer now. On the morning of the day before the equinox, Nishan was awakened from sleep by an odd prickling sensation in his ears. It was a sensation he'd experienced only once before in his life, during his novitiate, and it took him a moment to identify it. Then he realized what it was. Somebody was casting a spell against him. At last! At last! It had worked! Nishan put on his robe and hurried to the door of the hut. The day seemed remarkably overcast, almost like night, but that was caused by the spell. This one happened to involve the optic nerves. He began to grope his way cautiously toward the village centre. He didn't want the Frel to see him and get suspicious, but he did want to have the pleasure of seeing them cast their first accurate spell. He was well protected against wind damage from it, of course. When he was almost at the centre, he took cover behind a hut. He peered out. They were doing it right. Oh, what a satisfaction! Nishan felt his chest expand with pride. And when the spell worked, when the big wind swooped down and blew him away, the Frel would certainly receive a second magical missionary more kindly. Nishan might even come back, well disguised, himself. The ritual went on. The dancers made 3 circles to the left, 3 circles to the right. Cross over and all sprinkle salt on the interstices of the star Rahun had traced on the ground with the point of a knife. Back to the circle. 1 to the left, 1 to right, while Rahun in the center of the circle dusted over the salt with what? Hey! Nishan yelled in sudden alarm. Not brimstone! Watch out! You're not doing it right! His chest contracted suddenly, as if a large stony hand had seized his thorax above the waist. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think, he couldn't even say ouch. It felt as if his chest, no, his whole body, was being compressed in on itself and turning into something as hard as stone. He tried to wave his tiny, heavy arms in a counter-charm. He couldn't even inhale. The last emotion he experienced was one of bitterness. He might have known the Frel couldn't get anything right. The Frel take a dim view of the small stone image that now stands in the center of their village. It is much too heavy for them to move, and while it is not nearly so much of a nuisance as Nishan was when he was alive, it inconveniences them. They have to make a detour around it when they do their magic dances. They still hope, though, that the spells they are casting to get rid of him will work eventually. If he doesn't go away this autumn, he will the autumn after next. They have a good deal of faith in magic when you come right down to it, and patience is their long suit. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe for more every Monday and Friday. And for another story like this, I recommend The Desert and the Stars featuring Retief by Keith Laumer. A link to my narration of that story is on screen now.